Merci, Monsieur le Président. In 2004, the then opposition leader, today the Prime Minister, joined with Jack Layton in calling for a change to the standing orders of the House of Commons. They agreed that all MPs should be allowed to vote on any Canadian participation in armed conflicts. In 2006, the Conservative Party platform pledged, and I quote, to make Parliament responsible for exercising oversight over the conduct of Canadian foreign policy and the commitment of Canadian forces to foreign operations. You might notice it doesn't say to some foreign operations. There are no conditions, there are no exceptions. It doesn't say to combat missions ill-defined or not defined. In 2007, the Conservative speech from the throne, most formal form of address in our Parliament, reiterated, quote, our government has made clear to Canadians and our allies that any future military deployments must also be supported by a majority of parliamentarians. And you know how parliamentarians express their voice, Mr. Speaker, through a vote in this House. And in 2009, the Prime Minister declared unequivocally that his government would henceforth, again I quote, require that military deployments, any military deployments, would be supported by the Parliament of Canada. I listened with great interest as the Member of Parliament for Westmount Ville-Marie and after him the Liberal member for Vancouver Quadra expressed their unconditional support for what the government was doing. The only problem is we don't know what those troops are being asked to do on the ground. Reference back to last week's hearings in committee, of course, provide no information whatsoever. And I was gobsmacked to hear the minister evoke weapons of mass destruction. I had a feeling I had gotten into a time machine as the Conservatives were groping for a way to explain this thing. Then we just heard the parliamentary secretary say, with incredible arrogance, that they'll let us know when the 30 days are up. In other words, their timing is up to them. The contents of the mission will never be discussed in this House. And those who have been elected to represent Canadians will not be allowed to vote. The NDP does not accept this as Canadian power. Je suis extrêmement déçu que ni le Premier ministre ni le chef du Parti libéral s'expriment avec nous ce soir. C'est une question d'État, Monsieur le Président. C'est une question de définition du genre de société dans lequel nous acceptons de vivre. Et de notre côté, leur absence en dit très long. C'est un débat d'urgence, un événement rare dans notre vie parlementaire. Ils auraient dû être ici. Ils auraient dû s'exprimer. Mr. Speaker, it is important to understand the threat, and let's look at that objectively. Members of this House fully understand the serious humanitarian and security risk posed by the organization, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. The violence perpetrated by ISIL is reprehensible. Mass killings, sexual violence against women, threatening religious and ethnic minorities with genocide, forcibly displacing civilians and destroying holy sites. More than 1.5 million people have already been affected by the humanitarian situation in Iraq. It goes back far beyond the current one. 1.2 million people have been displaced, and conditions, of course, are worsening every day. Les Nations Unies ont déclaré qu'il s'agissait de ce qu'eux appellent l'état d'urgence maximal. La crise humanitaire et les menaces à la sécurité pourraient déborder le cadre des frontières de l'Irak et de la Syrie. Répondre aux menaces de l'EIL implique une évaluation profonde, sérieuse, de tous les faits sur le terrain et une compréhension claire du rôle que le Canada entend jouer. La part du gouvernement, le néant. Des phrases creuses, sans signification. C'est sur ce point que le gouvernement n'a pas été capable de répondre aux questions fondamentales des Canadiens et des représentants de la Chambre. Nous ne pouvons vaincre l'EIL en étant flous et en manquant de transparence. Mr. Speaker, we're not even told how many troops are being deployed after being told today that yesterday was several dozen, today it was 69. I was listening to the Minister of Foreign Affairs figure skating on one of the panel shows this afternoon, talking about, well, you know, it's about logistics and planes and how long it takes them to get out. We don't know. The government is not being transparent with Canadians. Plus important encore, personne ne nous a encore dit clairement ce que ces troupes vont faire pendant ce conflit. La seule réponse que nous avons, c'est que nos troupes conseilleront les combattants kurdes. Soit. Mais le ministre de la Défense a dit au Parlement et au Comité des Affaires étrangères que nos troupes ne seront pas dans un rôle de combat et qu'il ne s'agissait pas d'une mission de combat. Il a même répété « Nos troupes de combat ne fouleront pas le sol irakien. » Fallait le faire. Boots will not be on the ground. They're either wearing sandals or they're levitating. Which one is it? Mais il ne peut pas ou il ne veut pas répondre aux questions concernant le type de conseil qu'une douzaine d'unités de forces d'opération spéciales donneront aux combattants kurdes. Étant donné l'histoire des Peshmerga et leur connaissance et leur expérience accrue de la région, de quel conseil ont-ils besoin de la part du Canada? Mais si ces forces spéciales sont en train de conseiller parce qu'ils sont en train d'aider de viser au laser des cibles que quelqu'un d'autre va tirer, est-ce qu'il s'agit ça d'un conseil? Est-ce que c'est un jeu de mots, comme le député de Toronto, Dan Forth, a dit tantôt en citant le Premier ministre australien, qui dit « on joue avec les mots, on dit qu'on ne serait pas directement impliqué dans une cause où c'est juste nous ». C'est ça le jeu auquel on est en train de se livrer? J'en revenais pas tout à l'heure quand j'ai entendu la députée de Vancouver-Quadra, la libérale, qui s'est levée et elle a dit « il faudrait quand même, et je vais le donner en anglais comme elle l'a dit, « we should be briefed fully ». Ça, pour les libéraux, ça suffit en matière internationale. We should be briefed fully. Comme parlementaire, on n'a pas juste le droit d'être informé, on doit être consulté et on a le droit de voter, monsieur. The government says it will reassess our contributions in 30 days. We're not told what criteria they've used for the reassessment. And after all, this initial contribution was made at the request of Americans based on their assessments. It's safe to assume that this conflict will not end in 30 days, obviously. The U.S. administration has talked about a multi-year strategy, as did the Conservatives. It's no surprise that so many Canadians are deeply concerned about mission creep. This is a slippery slope, Mr. Speaker. These are serious strategic questions that need to be answered. You know, the lack of focus is not benign, especially when we enter the theater of war in a region marred by decades of conflict. If the government is incapable of answering basic strategic questions about its military commitment to Iraq, then how are Canadians to know what it was doing, and how are they to believe the information they're being given? It's quite clear from what we've heard tonight that they don't know what they're doing. And still, it's committing us to a conflict that will expand. That's why it's essential for the government to present a clear motion in the House that outlines the details of Canada's commitment to Iraq. Now, I said that the way it was meant. It is the government's responsibility, because I also heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs tonight saying it was the opposition's responsibility to bring it to a vote. Oh, we can, with an opposition day. But tonight we were supposed to get clear information and answers to our questions, and we've gotten nothing. Canadians don't know any more about this mission. After a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Canadians expect their leaders to approach potential military commitments with prudence and transparency. That's why Canadians will be deeply disappointed that the Prime Minister and Liberal leader did not participate in tonight's emergency debate. Now, we can all remember, back in 2003, the current Prime Minister, who at the time served as opposition leader, was so keen to join the U.S. military involvement in Iraq. He even penned an op-ed in an American paper bemoaning Canadian opposition to the war. We all remember that. Maybe the minister was hoping he'd get special bonus points for mentioning weapons of mass destruction tonight. Frankly, I think he's only embarrassed himself and his government. It is of particular concern that the government appears incapable of conveying a coherent understanding of the mission's objectives, strategy, costs, and timelines. Un tel flou de la part des libéraux a mené à près d'une décennie de dérive en Afghanistan. Cette Chambre doit se rappeler qu'au départ, l'intervention militaire canadienne en Afghanistan n'était censée être qu'un déploiement à court terme d'un petit groupe de militaires spécialisés. Ça vous dit quelque chose, Monsieur le Président? Cette mission avait également été lancée dans un flou semblable et sans qu'un débat ne soit tenu à la Chambre des communes. C'est pour ça que lorsqu'il était dans l'opposition, l'actuel premier ministre disait « ça n'a pas de bon sens que le Parlement ne soit pas consulté ». Mais j'imagine, comme on dit, « that was then, this is now ». Une décennie plus tard, un autre gouvernement risque de répéter les erreurs du passé en engageant le Canada dans une mission militaire en Irak cette fois-ci, sans avoir défini clairement le mandat des membres des forces canadiennes et sans avoir obtenu l'approbation du Parlement canadien. Same vagueness under the Liberals led almost to a decade of mission creep in Afghanistan. This House has to recall that Canada's involvement in Afghanistan also began with what was supposed to be a short-term deployment of a small group of Special Operations Forces. That mission also began under a veil of secrecy and without a debate and a vote in the House of Commons. A decade later, a different government risks repeating those same mistakes, and there's no excuse for it because they were the ones who stood up and said, we have to change the rules, Parliament has to be consulted, Parliament has to be informed, and Parliament has a right to vote on these issues. Now, there are clear humanitarian needs, and when it comes to the humanitarian needs on the ground and Canada's expertise in addressing these needs, there is no vagueness. Our foreign affairs critic was in Iraq just 2 weeks ago. Officials in Baghdad and in Erbil asked Canadian parliamentarians for a contribution to their humanitarian needs. Interestingly enough, Mr. Speaker, there was no request for Canadian military involvement in the conflict. We've called on the government to contribute to the United Nations appeal for aid to meet the needs of the internally displaced in Iraq. Winter's coming, and we have models from other countries like Norway that have sent in massive supplies to help. Nous avons pressé le gouvernement de contribuer à contrer la violence sexuelle. La représentante spéciale du secrétaire général chargée de la question des violences sexuelles a signalé de très nombreux actes de violence, dont des actes de violence sexuelle contre les femmes, les filles, les garçons, membres des minorités irakiennes. Le Canada pourrait affecter des fonds pour répondre aux besoins spéciaux des victimes de ces violences sexuelles. Nous avons demandé au gouvernement de veiller au respect du droit humanitaire international et de veiller à ce que les responsables de ces crimes de guerre soient jugés. Malgré les promesses du gouvernement, nous attendons toujours qu'ils agissent en la matière. Nous devons continuer d'accorder une attention particulière à la crise des réfugiés syriens, qui a déjà eu des grandes répercussions en Jordanie et en Turquie, qui, eux, sont en train de faire leur part. Malheureusement, on ne peut pas dire la même chose du Canada sous ce gouvernement conservateur qui ne fait rien. Mr. Speaker, there are too many unanswered questions about this government's approach to Iraq. We need immediate action on the humanitarian front. We need prudence and transparency on the military front. Tonight's debate cannot meet these objectives since the government still refuses to present a motion that clearly outlines the objectives, parameters, and timelines of this mission. The Prime Minister must keep his promise to Canadians and put this military deployment to a democratic vote of Canada's Parliament. Monsieur le Président, trop de questions demeurent sans réponse en ce qui concerne l'approche de ce gouvernement par rapport au déploiement des troupes canadiennes en Irak. Le Premier ministre doit tenir les promesses qu'il a faites aux Canadiens et soumettre cette question à un vote en Chambre. En l'absence d'un vrai débat, en absence de réelle information, personne de responsable peut appuyer cette mission en Irak, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has just laughed about the issue of weapons of mass destruction with his caucus members, just over 1 year after chemical weapons were used against the population of Syria. And if he does not realize that these terrorist groups did their utmost to try and acquire that capacity, and that they operate in both Syria and Iraq, and that the Taliban and al-Qaeda went to great lengths to try to acquire nuclear materials, he is showing deep ignorance, Mr. Speaker. I think he has shown us today the least serious speech by a leader of the opposition in this place on an important matter of international peace and security in the history of this place. Mr. Speaker, I have a question for the Leader of the Opposition. Is he listening? A CC-130 Hercules, a CC-177 Globemaster, supported by 75 Canadian Armed Forces personnel in the Mediterranean, 69 Special Operations members of the Canadian Forces advising the government of Iraq on how to enable security forces in the northern part of the country to be more effective against the threat they face, providing strategic and tactical advice in an advisory and assistance role, not in a combat role. Does he understand that? Does he know what our troops are doing after so many people have told him in plain English exactly what this mission amounts to? And how would he vote if it were brought to a vote in this place?
Leader of the Opposition.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est avec une certaine préoccupation pour le sérieux d'un ministre qui occupe un rôle aussi sérieux que j'ai écouté les sottises que vient de prononcer celui qui vient de nous parler. C'est ahurissant de confondre les armes chimiques utilisées par le gouvernement de la Syrie avec les terroristes. Ce canular d'armes de destruction massive qui était la base même de l'intervention erronée en 2003 est en train d'être répétée par un ministre de la Couronne en 2014. Quelle honte, Monsieur le Président! Quelle honte!
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Westmount Ville-Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition the following question. If at the end of this evening there was a vote, and if all of his questions were answered, if all of his questions were answered to his satisfaction, and he understood this to be a non-combat role behind the wire to be reviewed after 30 days, would he tell us if that was the situation and all his questions were answered? I would like to ask him, how would he vote?
L'Honorable Chef d'Opposition. L'Honorable Chef d'Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, beyond the wire, in an asymmetrical war, brilliant. Mr. Speaker, this is the team, the Liberal team, that has shown us what they think about international affairs. Their leaders stood up and applauded the government's European trade deal, a deal they had yet to read. They're standing up tonight and applauding the government's military intervention in Iraq, despite the fact that this House isn't being allowed to vote on it. And in his intervention, the Member of Parliament for Westmount Ville-Marie said this: if the rule does change, you're going to have to let us know and you're going to have to inform us. We don't want to be informed. We have a right to vote. We were elected to do a job. Too bad he doesn't do his.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have a question for the Leader of the Opposition in light of the comments heard here tonight from the member for Westmount Ville-Marie that Canadians should be prepared for a long battle, and the member for the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration talking about the length that this is going to take to do this work. And we have a 30-day mission with a vague mandate. I wonder, given the fact that mission creep has been dismissed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, what the Leader of the Opposition thinks of reports out of the U.S. that the Joint Chief of Staff's General Martin Dempsey is already talking about considering having the use of their military advisors in attacks against ISIS. Is that already, before we Canadians are even there, the Americans are talking about advancing the advisors. These are the advisors and assisters that we are going to be sending. They are looking at possibly using them for attacks on ISIS. Is he concerned? And does he wonder why Canadians are concerned about being potentially dragged into a war in Iraq?
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable colleague from St. John's East raises the most important question of all. What is the nature of this mission? What words are being played with as they describe an advisory role? These are Canada's top elite special forces. If they're targeting and it's someone else doing the shooting, is that just advising? We don't have any details about that. What we had tonight was a diatribe, un ramassis, of George W. Bush-era arguments.
Yes.
This is what we're listening to here tonight. There is nothing that has been put on the table tonight that would allow any reasonable Canadian to vote in favor of the mission being proposed by the Conservatives, because we know, as my colleague correctly points out, that the Americans are already talking about several years. Well, we've been down that path before. We've been down that path when the Liberals, after deciding correctly not to go into Iraq, decided that we should go into Kandahar unprepared for the situation that we were being put into. That's mission creep. That's the slippery slope that they're putting us on. That's why we are insisting not to be informed, but to be consulted and to have a right to vote based on full information. As things now stand, we do not have enough information to do that, and that's why the only responsible thing is to say no to the Conservatives.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell this member, Leader of the Opposition, that when this House was discussing the issue of Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, when the NDP was sitting over there, Mr. Speaker, the same argument they were trying to make, we don't want to go, we don't want to go, we don't want to do, looking for excuses, Mr. Speaker, to do all that. The same speech he's making here today was made by Jack Lytton and his people sitting over there. And Mr. Speaker, today,
the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary will come to order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, if there were still people listening tonight who thought that perhaps the government was serious, I think that all doubt has been removed.
That's right. Yeah.
What we're looking at now is the same thing we're going to be looking at from the government benches. Posturing, positioning, using the lives of our brave women and men in uniform, sending them into an ill-defined mission, asking Canadians to buy a pig and a poke. Canadians deserve to know what this mission is about, what the real dangers are. We're not going to be like the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to drag us down the slippery slope that brought us into Kandahar. We're not going to accept to be told by the Conservatives, especially when it's the same Conservatives who brought motion after motion to say that no Canadian military mission should ever take place without a vote in this House. That's what they said they wanted. That's what we demand. There should be a vote in the House of Commons on this mission.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the truth is that military missions happen all the time without votes in this House. We deploy people to join NATO missions, to join training missions, to join reassurance missions throughout the NATO area of operations without votes in this House. The reassurance mission to stand up to Vladimir Putin's aggression. We didn't hear the Leader of the Opposition complaining that we deployed Canadian forces there. Let's ask the Leader again. Is it that he doesn't believe, that he doesn't understand, or that he still doesn't know that this is a combat mission? Or is he still gobsmacked to learn that Osama bin Laden is actually dead?
Gobsmacked. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this coming from the same person who a little bit earlier this evening said that he took it really serious when someone in one of those groups said that they were going to take over everything from Al-Andalus, which is in Spain, to India. That's how serious he thinks this is. Mr. Speaker, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a government that doesn't even recognize that they're doing the exact same thing. And it's true. When we don't learn the lessons of history, we are condemned to repeat them. The lessons in Afghanistan was that we were drawn into a conflict that cost well over 100 Canadian lives, cost tens of billions of dollars, for a situation that is right now barely more stable than it was then. This is because the Conservatives and the Liberals simply followed all the instructions from other powers. This is not a NATO mission. There's no NATO mandate here. It has nothing to do with NATO. So any reference by this minister to NATO in Iraq shows the paucity of his empty rhetoric and his incapacity to present a case that will convince Canadians.
Yes, right.